Like many Philosophy 225 authors, Martin Luther King employs virtue ethics to talk about human goodness. Virtue ethics is the theory describing and organizing human goodness with the virtues. Let's review briefly. According to virtue ethics, there are three categories of virtues: the cardinal virtues, prudence, justice, temperance, and courage; empowering worldly actions; the intellectual virtues, wisdom, insight, sense, empowering various thinking activities; and the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, empowering my relationships with God. These virtues provide a model of human goodness. All areas of human goodness may be described and identified with these virtues. And it's worth noting that there are many synonyms and hybrids in our language. A person who's an expert in virtue ethics knows the 10 main virtues and can use these concepts to analyze a text like Martin Luther King's sermons. In Martin Luther King's sermons, there are 5 virtues which our author identifies as important for human life. Let's talk about the 5 virtues. The first 2 virtues are a pair: tough-mindedness and tender-heartedness. Our author introduces these virtues by way of sacred scripture. Let's read from page 492. Martin Luther King quoting, "Behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves." And then the quote continues, "Be therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves." I've looked at other translations of the New Testament, and in some cases, wise is translated as shrewd. That's often how it is with the virtues, that there are many variations and synonyms. So if you learn virtue ethics, you can begin to make sense of the confusion. So wisdom here doesn't refer to the Sophia of Aristotle, that virtue empowering and contemplating. Wisdom here is closer to what Aristotle calls insight. It's the virtue of experts who can discover observable truths. Well, let's look at Martin Luther King's discussion. First, Martin Luther King talks about the wise serpent with the phrase tough-mindedness. That's his interpretation of this virtue. For Martin Luther King, tough-mindedness is an intellectual habit. It's the ability and willingness to find observable truths in the people around us, truths about our society, truths about worldly affairs. A person whose tough-mindedness sort of persistently thinks and finds the truth. This would be an important virtue for civil rights activists who are dealing with prejudice and newspaper reports and civil laws. Martin Luther King must have studied Aristotle. He's familiar with the doctrine of the mean. And when he teaches us what tough-mindedness is, he also refers to the extreme habits or the bad habits to help us understand the virtue. Soft-mindedness is our author's term for the bad habit, where a person simply takes appearances as true and doesn't bother to look into the truth of things. Martin Luther King claims that consumerism today is caused by our soft-mindedness as a society. And racism, he proposes, is the result of soft-mindedness. People simply go by appearances and don't look further into people's hearts. On the other extreme is the bad habit in philosophy we call skepticism. It's the refusal to think about truths. It's the refusal to come to conclusions about people. It's the refusal to assent to truths. Tough-mindedness is between these two extremes, says Martin Luther King. Tender-heartedness is the second virtue. Tender-heartedness is that virtue empowering me to let people matter, to form relationships with people. I think a good synonym for tender-heartedness is sympathy. And in tradition, mercy is perhaps the best translation of tender-heartedness. It's the ability to let people matter and to, particularly their suffering. Martin Luther King claims that these two virtues are like opposites. How could a person be both tough-minded and tender-hearted? That's what the passage from sacred scripture implies to us, that these are like two opposite qualities. How can we be both these things? Well, Martin Luther King asserts that it is possible, and that, in fact, in a person, tough-mindedness balances with tender-heartedness and makes us a versatile and well-rounded person. Three additional virtues are explored in our sermons, and these are the theological virtues: faith, hope, and charity. Our author begins his discussion in the second sermon, A Knock at Midnight. There he indicates something we've learned from Aquinas, that these virtues are like gifts. So our author talks about persons of color going to church, knocking on the door to ask for these gifts because they're needed to cope with adversity or despair. Martin Luther King, when he first talks about theological virtues, introduces the idea of a midnight in a human life. A midnight in a human life is an episode or experience where our goals seem unattainable and adversity is overwhelming to us. So for him, the theological virtues are an important solution to midnight in a human life. Let's look at some statements where our author refers to each of the theological virtues. On page 504, Martin Luther King refers to faith. Martin Luther King writing, "At the center of the Christian faith is the conviction that in the universe there is a God of power who is able to do exceedingly abundant things in nature and in history." This conviction may be perhaps the very first article of faith that I believe when I am infused with faith. On pages 499 and 500, a powerful statement about hope. And here the author also refers to some philosophers. Reading at the bottom of the page on 499, Martin Luther King writing, "For so many people, young and old, the light of hope went out, and they roamed wearily in the dark chambers of pessimism." He's talking here about the 20th century, World War I and World War II, and the Great Depression. Many concluded that life has no meaning. Turning and looking at the top of page 500, Martin Luther King writing, "But even in the inevitable moments when all seems hopeless, men know that without hope they cannot really live. And in agonizing desperation, they cry for the bread of hope. Hope being an infused theological virtue. And then finally, charity, sometimes referred to as love. Martin Luther King talks about this virtue in The Interview. Let's hear him explaining what he means by love. This is on page 335. His friend Ken Clark has questioned how is it possible to love your adversary, especially when your adversary is somebody like Bull Connor, the mayor of, I think it's Birmingham, Alabama. Martin Luther King speaking, well, I think one has to understand the meaning of love at this point. I'm certainly not speaking of an affectionate response. And then toward the bottom of that paragraph, the Greek language comes out with the word agape, which is understanding, creative, redemptive goodwill for all men. In short, for Martin Luther King, charity or love is understanding, creative, redemptive goodwill for all men. Different from affectionate love. And going back to strength to love, there is a statement on page 509. This is an example of an act of charity on the part of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King is telling a story about a bomb threat, which eventually does take place. Martin Luther King's home is bombed. In this episode, he's just received a phone call of a threat, and he's prayed, and then he says, "At that moment, I experienced the presence of the divine as I had never before experienced him." In short, Martin Luther King understood that God was near him. That agrees with St. Thomas Aquinas and his proposal that charity is like a friendship with God. When I have charity, I live with God. I don't understand myself as living alone or with other people. Primarily, I understand myself as living with God. In Strength to Love, Martin Luther King refers to the three theological virtues as interior resources, and his proposal is that these interior resources contribute to the good life because they empower us when our human powers are insufficient for adversity or tragedy or failure. That agrees with St. Thomas Aquinas' definition of the theological virtues. And finally, it's worth to note that courage is also a virtue of importance to Martin Luther King and his community of persons committed to civil rights activism. There's a chapter of Strength to Love titled Antidotes to Fear, in which our author talks about the importance of courage. For now, we'll focus on those first 5 virtues as important to Martin Luther King.